that China is powerful and insecure.
As the feature of rampant misconceptions.
India and China cannot go to war.
That informal summits has its own limitations.
Hello and welcome to the dialogue. Today my guest is Dr. Jagannath Panda. Dr. Panda is a distinguished scholar on India's East Asia policy research. He is a research fellow and head of East Asia Center at the Institute of Defense Services and Analysis. He is in charge of informal and track to dialogue with think tanks and NGOs with China and other East Asian countries. He extensively writes on India's international relations, especially on India-China relations. His latest book, India-China Relations, Politics of Resources, Identity and Authority in Multipolar World Order, is an excellent work on international relations. Welcome to the dialogue, Dr. Jagannath Panda.
Thank you, Mr. Saqib.
Let me start with a basic question. How would you assess India-China relations pre and post-Galwan conflict?
I think there is definitely a connection, the way relationship is evolving from pre-Galwan period to the post-Galwan period. I think if we take into account the pre-Galwan period without really going too much to the history, we may start noticing a kind of new strategy on the part of the Chinese and also on the part of India from 2013 and 14 onwards, when there was leadership change on both the countries. We know that President Xi Jinping in China and Prime Minister Modi in India almost came to power at the same time around 2013 and 14. And since that time, both the countries have seen each other in a new context. And the context was to see each other as a developmental partner in order to engage in a much more pointed economic engagement strategy and try to take advantage of each other's association, not only at the immediate neighborhood or at the bilateral level, but also at the regional and global level. And if you see, the whole narrative of the developmental partnership was designed to strengthen the India-China relationship. So when we are talking about the pre-Galwan period, we are talking about a narrative of India-China relations, which was based on more of a engagement strategy, having a more economic-oriented partnership on the focus. Today, when we talk about the Galwan and the post-Galwan period, I think in many ways, Galwan incident was not only a defining element in India-China ties, but it was also a kind of incident which actually was a wake-up call for India. Because if we take into account the narrative of India-China relations after 1962 war, there was and particularly after the 1987 incident that happened in the India-China border, I think from that period onwards, there was a virtual understanding that, killing, firing, and engaging in a minuscule incident in the border region can be avoided in terms of maintaining peace and tranquility in the border regions. But that was not really maintained with the Galwan incident. And it was an eye-opener, it was a wake-up call for India. In a way, the Galwan incident not only defined the India-China relations in a new context, that the old trust, the old confidence has been dented, but it was certainly a wake-up call for India that the older narratives, as far as the Chinese is concerned, has been diminished, and India needs to look at China in a new context. So today, when we are talking about a post-Galwan period, we are actually trying to see China in a new context, in a much more nationalist context, and we see China in a much more alarmist and in an assertive context. And I think the way the Chinese military, Chinese leadership have responded to India and seen India, not only in the context of the Galwan, but also in the post-Galwan context, that is a worrisome trend. So therefore, I think there is a huge difference between the perceptual level when we are talking about the pre-Galwan and the post-Galwan, each other's country towards each other, and that should not be discounted. And I think one another interesting point that needs to be maintained and should be mentioned to the public is that I think what we are seeing that in the pre-Galwan period, there was an acknowledgement from both the sides that, the informal summit and particularly the leadership chemistry that was emerging between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, that would in a way keep the momentum up in India-China relations. But today, after the Galwan incident, what we are seeing that probably we are arriving to a tentative conclusion by saying that probably the leadership chemistry and the informal summits are not really going to help stabilizing the India-China relationship. And therefore, we need to be cautious about each other's perception towards each other, what the core strategic constituencies are looking at each other. And therefore, particularly for India, Indian strategic community and Indian government should be mindful about China, and China should be seen in a case-by-case context, in a much serious context in comparison to the pre-Galwan phase.
People in India are generally intrigued by the timing of the Galwan incident. 2020 was quite an eventful year for the world, especially for China. China was under cloud due to spread of COVID. It was engaged in bitter war with the United States. There was disturbances in Hong Kong. So with all this going on, why will China pick a new conflict with India?
I think it has a number of reasons attached to it. The first and fundamental reasons that we need to take a note of, that I think for a long time, the Chinese are seeing a serious activism in Indian foreign policy. India coaching up to the US, India coaching up to Japan, and India strengthening ties with most of the Indo-Pacific countries, including Australia. And that has not really been going well with the Chinese leadership. And there is a nervousness is noticed on the Chinese leadership part. But more than that, I think what has happened all this while is that I think this is critical from India's point of view to note that the Chinese have always thought that if there is any country in Asia that could remotely challenge to its authority and to its rights, that is India. And if they can make a statement against India by posing a concern, by posing a threat, or challenging India on the boundary issues, they can make a statement to the rest of the regions, including the United States of America. And I think that is one of the fundamental reasons how the Communist Party's foreign policy strategy really works. And today, when we see after 2015 and 2016 PLA reforms and restructuring, the different commands of the PLA has their own say in the Chinese foreign policy decision-making process. And therefore, when we are talking about the Tibetan Plateau command regions of the PLA, they have a substantial say on China's India policy. So today, the PLA and the ground level forces, those who are actually deployed on the India-China boundary, they do influence the China's decision-making process, heavily passing a message that it is India who should respect China as a neighbor and should not really engage in anti-China activities with US, with Japan, and with Australia. And I think these are the fundamental reasons why the Chinese have again decided to create a raucous in the India-China boundary regions, particularly against India. But there is also one more important point that we need to take into account. I think the Chinese have also seen the leadership quality of Prime Minister Modi. That is an important, significant part if you try to understand from the Chinese point of view. The Chinese leadership did not see the previous Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, so highly. Neither they see Dr. Manmohan Singh as an astute political leader, nor did the Chinese see the previous government in India as a very strong nationalist government. But with this government, with the BJP-led government in India and the Prime Minister Modi, the Chinese have taken a strong note that Prime Minister Modi is a nationalist leader, he is a populist leader, and the government which is there in Delhi is a strong government when it comes to national security of India, when it comes to sovereignty matters of India. And the current government in India has a strong say when it comes to the boundary issues, on the territorial matters, including matters related to the immediate neighbors, that is Pakistan and China. And I think that has actually encouraged the Chinese leadership, the PLA jars, and the Chinese strategic communities to take much more seriously and pursue a antagonistic policy towards India and keep Indian government, the leadership, and the strategic communities keep on, thinking that China is not an easy power, and India should value the partnership with China. Most importantly, India should value China as an important neighbor.
Yeah, Dr. Panda, as you mentioned that PLA plays a very significant role when it comes to India-China relations. Does that mean that formal and informal meetings between leaders such as Wuhan and Chennai don't matter much in India when China's policy towards India?
Yes, I think what we need to understand is that Chinese decision-making process is very complex and very dense. There was a time when it was Mao Zedong who used to take a call. But then, towards the beginning of this century, under the presidency of Hu Jintao, the former Chinese president, the Chinese decision-making became much more fragmented, much more decentralized. But under Xi Jinping, the Chinese decision-making again getting unified and again becoming a much more centralized process. Mm-hmm. So in that centralized process, as Xi Jinping has enjoyed absolute command over PLA and the party officials and party structures, so PLA has a significant say over China's foreign policy decision-making. As you will recall, when Xi Jinping came to India at the invitation of Prime Minister Modi in 2014 for the first time after Prime Minister Modi became the Prime Minister of India, that time the Chinese actually orchestrated the Chumar incident when President Xi Jinping was here in India. So that means there was some kind of a parity of understanding between Communist Party and the PLA that this kind of incident should be created when the Chinese president is visiting India. So that means what we are drawing a conclusion is that Chinese foreign policy, unpredictability and giving surprises becomes the hallmarks of its decision-making process, where PLA, strategic communities, classical communist jars, and the new Communist Party inducted members, they have a significant say. Now, in coming back to your question that whether the informal summits are really defunct and whether it has lost its relevance, I think to some extent, the Chinese have succeeded to make a point that informal summits has its own limitations. Because let's not forget, I think the first informal summit was proposed from India's side and from Prime Minister Modi's side. And I think to that effect, the one informal summit was a significant development in terms of diffusing tensions around that time. And as a result, what we saw, the Mahabalipuram informal summit, the second one, was also equally a tension diffusing summit in terms of bringing some kind of temporary solace to the bound tensions in India-China relations. But today, after the Galwan incident, what we are drawing a conclusion is that informal summits has its own limitations. And the leadership chemistry should not be really seen as a final barrier to stabilize India-China relations. And I think we should be mindful about that. And the Chinese have succeeded to some extent in terms of creating a logic that informal summits has its own limitations, and we should not be really mistaken about that.
Recently, you have written that it is not border technicalities which have dented India-China ties. Then what is it? I mean, what is it at the core of India-China conflict?
My whole argument was that it is not the technicalities of the boundary dispute. That is actually behind the episodes of the incidents that is happening in recent time. It is the temperament of the both the countries that is actually creating problems, and boundary dispute is one such incident. And let me explain this aspect as we have to see it in a greater context. If we take into account the 2014 Chumar Valley incident, then the incident of 2017 that is in Dukla, and then we take into account the incident of Galwan incident in 2019 or 2020. Each one of these incidents has its own logical connections. That means when we connect the dots, we draw a thing that there is something new coming up every time there is an episode of this nature is happening, and the Chinese are claiming new territorial grounds as far as India is concerned. So with each one of these claims or incidents, the Chinese are actually claiming new grounds against India. Now, why they are claiming these new grounds? Partly they want to make a case that the status quo logic is not really working. We need to really revisit each one of these issues in a new context, because China has a new claim. China has a claim which is very original, but China is only claiming it now because India is building infrastructure and carrying out many other activities. Now, all of these issues has a grander narrative, has a bigger narrative. What is the narrative? That each one of these border incidents are linked with the foreign policy issues. That it is the nationalist temperament of both the countries, their foreign policy strategy, their infrastructure development, their military modernization, and their strong leaderships are actually posing context to each other. So it's a contesting phenomenon which is in each other's constituency that is actually encouraging or drawing each other's military troops to create such kind of incident. Now, if we see also from another angle, all of these incidents that has happened in the last few years, particularly after President Xi Jinping has come to power, each one of these incidents are nothing new in the sense that the line of actual control has always been a problematic aspect in India-China boundary dispute. So with the Galwan incident, with the Doklam incident, with the Chumar incident, there is nothing new that what the Chinese are saying and what India is saying, that the line of actual control is not really defined or not really been determined. Because these are classical problems. These not defining the line of actual control has always been a classical problem between India and China for a long, long time, for decades. So this is nothing new, a problem. But what is new is that the temperament. So the logical aspects behind these boundary disputes are the more encouraging aspects, and there we should not be misjudging the incident. So it is not the technical aspects, it is the temperament in each of the countries, the leadership qualities, the nationalist policy planning, the foreign policies aspects of each of the countries, and the rise of India, which the China is unable to accept it.
Recently, you have also written that India sees itself as playing greater role at regional and global stage. What does it mean? Is it that India is more developed and influential now, or is it due to external factors? I mean to say that there is a kind of realignment of friendships. Apparently, there is emergence of a new grouping of countries which make India an important player.
I think if we try to understand from India's point of view, for a long time, India has been occupied in its neighborhood politics, particularly in dealing with Pakistan and to some extent China. Today, I think Indian foreign policy has become much more versatile. It is having a multi-alignment foreign policy framework, and within that multi-alignment foreign policy framework, there is a serious focus on certain countries. So it's a pointed engagement strategy that is India following in order to engage with the US, with Japan, with Australia, with a range of other Indo-Pacific countries. And to that effect, India is in a better position to engage with many countries, many regions outside its neighborhood regions. And more importantly, some of these countries of in the wider Indo-Pacific regions, they also see India in a new context. They do see India as a rising powers and as a rising Indo-Pacific powers, and India has a potential to take the politics forward in the favor of free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think to that effect, that has unnerved the Chinese, and that has disturbed the Chinese to some extent, how India is becoming the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific politics, and how India is, becoming the eye-catching country in the whole world politics today vis-a-vis China. And therefore, it has encouraged the Chinese leadership and the strategic communities to take a strong note of India's rise and foreign policy activism, and hence pursue a negative and a antagonistic policy towards India.
On China's engagement with other countries, you have recently written that when Beijing engages with other countries, it does not see the nature of regime, ideology, or human rights. They do it in their national interest. But don't other countries behave the same way? Do you think countries that claim to be champions of democracy and human rights care about the nature and ideology of regime while engaging with them?
I think it's a delicate matter, and we have to see from country to country and regime to regime. Not all the democratic countries in the world are particularly, protecting human rights, valuing, the rights of the people, and echoing the democratic spirits. There are democratic countries who are having stronger nationalist government, and they are quite harsh on democratic issues, including human rights issues. But when we are talking about here democratic countries in comparison to China, I think there is a clear-cut division. In China, we are talking about an authoritarian country. In China, we are talking about an authoritarian regime, which is much more assertive in its approach in terms of dealing with problematic issues in the regions, and not really valuing its minorities, its rights of the peoples, and trying to implement harsh measures. I think that's the defining line. And when it comes to territorial integration and national sovereignty, the Chinese government is quite assertive and aggressive. If we take the example of, let's say, Hong Kong, let's take the example of Xinjiang, let's take the example of the Tibetans in Tibet regions. I think these issues are non-compromising from Chinese point of view, but these are democratic issues that China should be actually, and the regime in China should be actually respecting for. So I think there is a defining line between why we are comparing a democratic setups and regime with authoritarian regimes. But I think more than that, what needs to be said is that probably many democratic countries in the world, be it from Europe, be it from many other countries, including in Asia, they're not really uniforms in maintaining the same kind of democratic spirits in terms of talking to and handling the human rights issues. There should be uniformity when it comes to human rights and protecting values and rights of the people and respecting the people's livelihood and religion.
So don't you think that China is judged rather harshly because it is not a democracy in a conventional sense? You look at the USA, which is supposed to be the beacon of democracy, but it engages with all kinds of authoritarian regimes where there is not an iota of democracy. Look at their human rights history and their support to countries with worst human rights records. See its relationship in the Middle East.
It's a part of the US foreign policy strategy. They act from a position of strength and they use the democratic logic to their advantage, to their favors in different parts of the globe. And therefore, we should not be misjudged. And I do agree with you that there is a clear contradiction between US approach and stand on issues related to China and US stand and support towards the Israelis against the Palestinians. So there is a clear-cut divisions. But I think what we need to also take into account is that many democratic countries, including in the US, there is a rule of law. There are institutions who can question the government of the day about their violation of human rights. But that is not the case in China. And I think there the defining line comes that rule of law and the constitutional authority in the democratic countries are much higher. Where in the authoritarian countries, it is the party, it is the leadership that comes beyond that comes before the rule of law, before the constitutions, and therefore there is a logic to raise questions about China when it comes to China's track record about human rights values, and people's livelihood.
Let me ask you about another new nagging issue between India and China, which is the revival of Quad. Do you think Quad is for real? And also, is it Asian NATO as Chinese describe it?
I think we are living in an era of multipolarity, and there will be many level of power interactions, power configurations. So Quad is a mini-lateral group. It's a quadrilateral formulations, but it echoes a spirit of mini-lateral groupings in Indo-Pacific, and it is here to stay. And the strength of the Quad is that it brings together four democratic countries who believes in protecting values, endorsing rule of law, and try to strengthen the liberal international order. So I think that's the uniqueness about the Quad. It talks about maritime freedom. It talks about rule of law and rules-based order. And I think not all the countries in the world endorses such kind of advocacy. So therefore, the Quad are a configurations which is a many-lateral configuration, and it is here to stay. And particularly with the Quad ministerial level meetings, and now with the leadership meeting, we do see that this grouping is gaining strength from time to time, and it is here to stay. And probably in times to come, it will emerge as one of those defining groups in world politics to shape the narratives of Indo-Pacific.
Now that the Quad has been extended to Quad Plus, which makes Quad more open and inclusive with rather broad agenda, how do you see India's role in Quad Plus when it is becoming more inward looking?
The Quad Plus formulation is an abstract concept, and it echoes the principles of inclusiveness. So we cannot say that Quad Plus is an alliance building exercise. Quad Plus is an open framework that allows India and many other countries to sit together and have an open discussion and debate about critical issues, including the current pandemic. So I think such kind of groupings are always welcome to have. Actually endorses the Quad framework as the Quad countries takes a lead in the Quad Plus framework. So in no ways, Quad Plus framework is an alliance building exercise. In no ways, Quad Plus exercise is a framework that is against China. The Quad Plus framework is a much more open and deliberate framework to have an open structure of discussion and trying to strengthen the narrative of Indo-Pacific. And this is what India is currently believing in terms of participating in the Quad Plus framework. When we talk about Quad Plus ASEAN, that means we are talking about endorsing the ASEAN centrality in Indo-Pacific politics, in world politics, in regional politics, at the same time allowing some of the countries from ASEAN regions to come and engage in a open and free discussion that actually promotes the values of Indo-Pacific, rules-based order, and echoes the spirits of free and open Indo-Pacific maritime order. So I think there the merits of the Quad Plus framework comes. A Quad Plus framework is not here to talk about a particular issue like maritime issue. It talks about a range of issues that concerns the regions, that concern the countries of the participation framework. And therefore, it is a necessary framework that we need to really endorse and promote probably in times to come.
Well, since India is a very important and active member of the Quad, do you think it will have an impact on India's position in other organizations such as SCO and BRICS?
I think when it comes to Quad, India's approach to the Quad process has evolved to a great extent. Initially, India was not very clear about how to see Quad as a multilateral framework and how to go about it. But today, I think with the continuous leadership meeting, there is an acknowledgement that Quad is here to stay and India is a critical component of the Quad process. And the kind of bilateral engagement we are having with the US, with Japan, with Australia, with the US. So if we take into account our partnership with the US after signing the 4 foundational agreement, the way we have signed the AXA with Japan and strengthened the partnership with Japan, and the way we have also signed a security pact with Australia, all of this points to the fact that India believes in strengthening the Quad narratives and the relationship with the individual Quad countries. But while saying that, I think this is not an overture to revisit India's approach towards BRICS and SCO. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, India's foreign policy has been a multi-aligned foreign policy framework. And to that effect, I think India would hold a significant attachment towards the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where it is a member, and also with the BRICS, which is where India is also a founding member. So I think To that effect, India would continue its engagement with both Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. But while saying that, I think after the Galwan incident, India's approach towards Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS might change a little bit. A non-serious approach might be witnessed from India's point of view. And India really might not really be taking the SCO and BRICS as two critical foreign policy organizations in its foreign policy. So therefore, there might be some revisit in India's approach, and India might rethink how to go about these two particular groupings where China and many other countries are involved. But this is not to suggest that India will withdraw from these groupings. However, what is really important to mention here is that I think India would like to see how China is behaving towards India, what is China's approach, both within SCO and within the BRICS towards India. And China's approach towards India will shape India's perception and approach towards SCO and BRICS vis-a-vis China in times to come.
Well, apparently China is unhappy that India has not joined BRI. For India, CPEC was the reason. But hypothetically, if CPEC was not part of BRI, do you think India would have joined it?
I think there would have been a positive consideration from India, though it would be superficial to say that India would have joined. I think there is a defining line of element in Indian foreign policy framework when it comes to China and China's initiatives. For example, the BRI, India did not support the BRI because obviously because of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and more importantly, the Belt and Road Initiative was entirely Chinese initiative. It was based on a unilateral initiative of China. It was based on a nationalist planning and national planning of Chinese government. That was not the case with regard to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. In fact, in Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is a fine example of how India endorsed a multilateral practice because it was based on a multilateral framework. It was based on a universalist framework, and therefore India decided to be a part of their narrative, and India supported China about AIIB. But that was not the case with BRI. So there is a defining line that India support universal elements, multilateral frameworks that where India has been consulted, and India is a party in its founding membership, in its founding of the organization. But that was not the case with the BRI. And therefore, India did oppose to become a part of the BRI. And India did oppose because of the CPEC and many other issues, which are not really transparent as far as BRI, China's BRI is concerned.
Well, you are right. BRI is a unilateral initiative of China to enhance their political, economic, diplomatic influence. But basically, economic activities are the core of BRI. Don't you think India could have gained economically by joining it?
No, I think what we need to be clear about is that BRI is not really entirely an economic employment strategy. It is much more than that. BRI has a severe security, initiatives, security angle attached to it. BRI has equally political and strategic motives attached to it, apart from key economic motives. If we talk about the BRI, there are 6 corridors are attached with the BRI. Even though it has 2 broad formulations, that is the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road, but BRI has 6 corridors. Each of these 6 corridors has significant economic, security, and military dimensions attached to it. And India should not really misread about that. So BRI is not really entirely about economic employment strategy of China. It is much more than that. And therefore, I think there are severe implications for India when it comes to China's BRI.
Recently, you wrote that India-China relations will remain contrarian in 2021. What does it imply?
I think both the countries need to engage with each other. This is a critical relationship of Asia, and this is a critical relationship of the world politics. Of course, many would argue that it is the US-China relationship that will define the world politics. But I would say it is the India-China relationship that will be shaping and having, a significant, enormous implications for the world politics, including Asian geopolitics, and that should not be discounted. China is rising as a prominent power. India too is rising, and therefore both should realize the importance of each other in bilateral sphere, in regional, and in a cross-continental global context, and that should not be discounted. But while saying that, I think the kind of decision-making process we are seeing in each other's country towards each other, the nationalist thinking, and their ambition to secure more energy resources, their ambition to secure their identity as a prevailing power in Asian politics, are going to come as an antagonistic element in their relationship, and therefore India-China relationship would continue to become unstable, and the relationship will stay contrarian, not only in 2021, but it also beyond that in times to come.
Let me ask you that what will you suggest as a way forward to resolve current impasse between them?
I think what we need is that we need a practical assessment of each other's strength and weaknesses, and both the countries need to understand that they need to see each other in a new context, in their own merit, and they should value each other's rights, and they should not allow any third countries to become a party to affect the bilateral ties. And I think if they are mindful about third country intervention, interference in their bilateral ties, if they keep the third countries aside and separate in their bilateral dealings, that will be the most accurate and probably a mindful thing for India-China relations stability. And both the strategic communities in both sides should act towards in this direction, and they should have a much more practical oriented, much more future oriented outlook to stabilize this relationship. And I think that would act as a background to stabilize and guide the India-China relations in times to come.
Thank you very much,
you,
Dr.
Mr.
Jagannath Panda.
Saqib.
It was indeed a
And,
pleasure talking
thank
to
you
you.
for
Thank you
inviting
so
me,
much.
and great pleasure to talk to you on this forum.